All right, I want to move on to the residential purchase agreement, which the state form, I want to tell you a little bit about it first and then talk about some specific provisions. But we created this state form with uh, the goal, and it's a purchase agreement, with a goal that if you follow the form, you'll have everything you need to make a clean transfer of property, and you'll have reminders in it to uh, help your clients in the process. So, and we set it up so that it's a check the box. In other words, and we set it up so that transactions would go through. So when you look at the residential purchase agreement and you're filling it out, the first thing you got to put down uh, is your company and who you are. Why? So the title company knows where to pay compensation. All right. And in the form, we set it up for the uh, buyer's company, the buyer's agents to clearly list who they are and who they represent. So that's the first portion of the residential purchase agreement. Identifies the seller's agent, identifies the buyer's agent, and and there is one block. Again, I told you be back to this. It says both the buyer and the seller. So it says agent is the agent of check the box, either seller exclusively, buyer exclusively, or both the buyer and seller, limited dual agency. Again, don't do dual agency if you can absolutely avoid it. The times I would say you would avoid it are if an agent is working with a client as a buyer, and after beginning that relationship, somebody comes to that very same agent and wants to list the property. And you know, you can take the listing, that's not an issue. You should take the listing. And if you know that your buyer client, this is the house that would work for them, then you're already representing the buyer, so there's not much you can do but do a dual agency. Then you do the dual agency forms and go through with it. In my book, other than that situation, don't do dual agency. All I see is that circumstances, we'll have situations where, uh, I'm working with one right now where we're representing an agent and the agency and the brokerage. On a defensive posture, we're working for the E&O carrier is paying us, but the issue never would have come up but for dual agency. So going beyond that, next thing I want to mention, under the purchase agreement, paragraph 3 is personal property. The concept of fixtures are personal property or equipment that is so affixed to real estate as to become part of real estate. We see a lot of issues that come down where the concept of fixtures is semi-debatable. It isn't particularly to me, but it turns out to be problematical. And we get a lot of hotline calls about that. If there's a question mark about things, write in your paragraph what transfers with the real estate, what conceptually personal property transfers with the real estate. Normally, the kitchen appliances, they should be spelled out. Somebody could take out a refrigerator lickety split. Issues that come up that we see, and probably the ones that are very questionable, hot tubs, uh, they really aren't affixed, but they sure look like they're fixed, and they're so big it's hard to move them. Uh, Ceiling fans, uh, those kind of items. If in doubt, write it out. Just put it there. And particularly if it's an issue to your buyer. If you're going through a house and the buyer says, wow, I love these ceiling fans. Well, for sure, make sure they're written down. We've uh, we've seen in the past some crazy stuff that is taken out of a house by a seller, and the seller's not intending necessarily to screw the buyer, but it may certainly seem that way. One time we got a call, a seller had taken doors off inside the house, pulled the pins off the doors, took them with them because they had sentimental value to the seller did that. They had sentimental value to the seller. Well, there's no way the buyer wasn't expecting to see doors in the house when he arrived after the closing. So we got that straightened out. But if in doubt, write it out. And on the flip side, if a seller wants to prohibit stuff from going, if he wants to keep things that are in the house that would create some misunderstanding, then by golly, you got to make sure that's in the agreement. If he wants to keep ceiling fans, you got to write that in, uh, because you'll avoid an argument. In our practice, we see a lot of realtors, or talk to a lot of realtors. It's pretty hard to see them without, uh, these days, because we're not having meetings and a bunch of stuff. But the reality is, we'll get calls from realtors that after a transaction, when a seller or a buyer is complaining about something, and they complain to you guys, they complain to their realtor, and they want their realtor to do something about a seller or a buyer that is whichever it is that the other side did, that feels that they didn't do things correctly. Well, your standard response to that should be, well, you're going to have to go talk to an attorney about it. I can't interpret your contract for you. But the point is, people will come to you if something doesn't go right in that transaction. And you don't want that to happen. So make it as clear as possible when you fill out the contract, what's going on. Personal property, if in doubt, write it out. All right. Under paragraph 4, we're talking price and terms. Uh, and generally in there's a clause that says an earnest money deposit of $ blank to be applied to the purchase price is paid herewith as shown by the receipt herein. We probably in the future, we may go to a check the box there, because frequently earnest money will be paid directly to a title company or whoever's going to close the transaction. what I want to point out is make sure that what happens in your transaction is accurately reflected by paragraph 4. If not, draw a line through it and make sure it's clear in the addendum or in the blanks under paragraph 5 what really happens or what really is intended to happen. So, but you also, even if you do collect the money, uh, you have to have authority to transfer earnest money. Buyer's agent that collects the earnest money has a duty to give it to the seller's agent. Seller's agent has to put it in the bank promptly. But to move it from the bank to the title company for the closing, you have to have authority for that. We built that authority into the purchase agreement, but I want you to know that. And when in paragraph 4, the language says the earnest money will be transferred to escrow agent or listing broker. Generally speaking, if this is filled out by a buyer's agent, they ought to be saying listing broker, but it can say direct either way. All right. I want to point out a couple things a couple contingencies in the purchase agreement, and just to point out a couple differences. In the agreement, paragraph 4 is price and terms, and it gives a number of check the box options. 2 of them are contingent upon closing and contingent upon sale and closing. The distinction is in place for a simple reason. One, generally speaking, in real estate markets in Nebraska, that if somebody's going to buy a house, they've got to sell one to get the money. And what we've got in here is a circumstance set up, those 2 contingencies. One is should be used if the buyer has to go out and sell their own house, put it on the market and sell it, and get the cash, enable them to buy the house they're doing the purchase agreement for. The other is if they've already sold the house, but they have to have it closed to get the money to buy the new house. So just watch that distinction, and the contingencies are important so people don't get stuck in the middle. I was with some guys in South Dakota last weekend, and which incidentally, the pheasant hunting was terrific in South Dakota last weekend. The weather was beautiful, shirt sleeves. Sunday was pretty windy, but other than that, in any case, I was with a couple of home builders, good friends of mine and one of their wives is a realtor in South Dakota who was complaining about a circumstance where they had a house sale with a contingency or without no contingencies on closing of they had a purchase agreement which had no contingency for the buyer to get out of the sale if they didn't sell their own house, and created a problem because the VA was a VA sale and didn't appraise. And what happened was they had to sell their house and get out of it. And the house they were buying didn't appraise. And consequently, that sale fell through. So they were caught. They didn't have a house to move into, and they had to get out of their old house. So it kind of created a problem. D and E contingencies are to help you avoid that. All right. Paragraph 6 of the purchase agreement is talks about title. And in it, the situation says, seller agrees to convey marketable title to buyer by warranty deed or some other blank, which could be conservator's deed, could be trustee's deed, could be a lot of different things depending on the seller. Corporate warranty deed if it was a corporation. Free and clear of all liens, encumbrances, special assessments levied or assessed, and subject to all easements and restrictions or covenants now of record. What I want to point out is the purchase agreement is set up so that those might not necessarily be reviewed before the purchase agreement is made. The easements, restrictions, or covenants now of record. So if certain things like that are going to be important to your buyer, you might want to take a look at title before you make a commitment for the purchase agreement. Because you're agreeing in the purchase agreement, the buyer's agreeing to take subject to easements, restrictions, or covenants of record. The seller's been living with them, so it's usually not an issue at all, but sometimes it could be. All right. Paragraph 7, and this is one of the situations that we've tried to build into the purchase agreement to make it easier for realtors to do your job. SID disclosure is paragraph 7. And what we've done is create a check the box so that you realtors will know if there's a check in there, and there should be if it's an SID, that you need to make sure other paperwork gets to your buyer or gets to the buyer. Seller's agents need to know whether it's an SID or not. Buyers should too. Buyer's agents should too. And if it's an SID, you've got some additional disclosure requirements. Same with condominium disclosure, the next paragraph, and lead-based paint disclosure in the next paragraph. We've got situations in there in the purchase agreement so that you can go and make the determination of those, and that triggers additional disclosure duties. And we tried to do that for you. All right. I want to talk about the next paragraph, so or another paragraph, so that you'll know something about it. That's the inspections paragraph. The concept of the purchase agreement and the concept of our real estate law, particularly the Seller's Property Condition Disclosure Act law, is we're going to try and get a buyer to know as much about the property as possible and take the risks with that knowledge. And consequently, we have set up a purchase agreement that really encourages inspections and puts in as many blocks as we can to reliance by a buyer on what a selling agent, their own agent, the buyer's agent may say to them, or what the seller's agent may say to them. Okay. we're trying to get as much information on the table as possible. And from that, a buyer can make their choices. So there is a section about inspections and a contingency for the property passing inspection in acceptable terms to the buyer. What my comment is, and what I want you to think about is set the price of the house as it should be set, seller's agents. Buyers, pay a reasonable price for the house. No house is perfect. Not a brand new one, and certainly not one that's 40 years old. They're not perfect. And the inspection provisions and contingency is not a way to discount the price of a house. We see it frequently in that manner. People want to they'll have an inspection, the inspectors will point out things, and a buyer will want to fix those things. They'll want to get them fixed, and they'll put down, fix this, fix that in a inspection addendum coming back. I'm telling you, if it was me, I'd say, no, I'm selling you a 40-year-old house. You're buying it with its faults. You fix it when you get it, if that's an issue to you. I've got it priced right. Or if it's not priced right, if it's peanuts, go ahead. Tell your seller, fix it. For $500, it's not worth the hassle of trying to find somebody else, or whatever the number might be. But the concept is to get information on the table for a buyer to see if there's something significantly wrong with the property, they can get out from a sale. And we'll see issues like if there are major issues, and sometimes there are, an opportunity for a buyer to reject a house. I've seen it done, and it's appropriately done frequently. Sometimes it brings to mind certain issues that make the finances of a house or the financial situation of a buyer way different. For instance, if someone finds out in an inspection that the house is or the roof is trashed, roof repair would be a pretty significant cost to a buyer if they, for some reason, even nowadays, generally with there are certain amounts of money you got to spend to do a roof repair no matter what. You're going to have your deductible. I think the most common deductible now on a roof's like $5,000, $10,000. Well, there's a lot of workforce home buyers out there that don't have an extra $5,000 if something would happen. So issues like that, the inspection provisions of your purchase agreement are there to work out, and both for the buyer and for the seller. Everything else is pretty self-explanatory. I will say something about the provision. If checked, there's a mediation and arbitration provision in the agreements. I'll tell you why. Mediation and arbitration are both a heck of a lot cheaper and a heck of a lot faster than for dispute resolution than going to the courts. That's why there's a mediation and arbitration option. Mediation is alternate dispute resolution that is entirely in the hands of the seller or the buyer. They can agree or they cannot agree to find a resolution in mediation. Arbitration, on the other hand, uses a outside judge, if you will, but it's not a judge through the governmental system. It's one that you agree that you'll follow his directive. You'll agree that you'll live by the arbitrator's judgment. But it's faster. Generally, it is cheaper because it doesn't take as much lawyer time and process time to get things done. But there's still a cost, and somebody's going to be making the decision anyway. Around Lincoln, the arbitrators are generally former judges. So you're going to get about the same viewpoint on things one way or the other. But again, it's up to the buyer or the seller whether they want to have any disputes governed by an arbitrator or governed by the courts. So that's the point of that. All right. That's all I want to ask about or talk about on the purchase agreement. I think most things are pretty the purchase agreement. Okay, so I'm going to look here, and I probably should have been doing this a little earlier, but where do you write in question? And if you have questions, it's probably easiest for me to see them on if you type them into the chat room. The question is, where do we write in something the seller wants to keep? Question mark. In the MLS, question mark. I would write it in I think it's a good idea to have it in the MLS, in the remark section in the MLS, but you really want it in the purchase agreement. So in the face of the purchase agreement, I would say there's a lot of blanks under personal property. I'd make it clear under personal property that seller will retain ceiling fans. Seller will retain stained glass window in master bedroom or whatever the issue might be. You could do it in the paragraph 5 other provisions, or you could make just a separate addenda and that says seller wants to keep the stained glass window. All right. Checking the box, we're going to do some, I'm going to answer some questions now. Checking the box and initialing by arbitration and mediation means the parties waive it. I don't think so. I think that means if you check the box, in the state form, that means arbitration and mediation applies, not doesn't apply. If you want to go to the courts to settle your disputes, don't check the box. So I hope that answers that question. With dual agency form, when does buyer sign? When you're showing them a house where you have the listing, or when they write an offer on a house that you have the listing on. If you're taking an offer, people see the house, I would not do the dual agency form when you necessarily show a listing. I would tell you certainly could, but the time you absolutely have to have the dual agency form it's got to be in your hand when you're carrying a purchase offer forward. And when you start writing a purchase offer on a property that is your own listing, purchase offer with a buyer on a property that's your own listing, and you're not treating him as a customer, then you need to have that dual agency signed. And I would sign it before they sign the purchase agreement. Have them sign it before they sign the purchase agreement. Then you carry that dual agency form and the purchase agreement together to the seller for dealing with them. And you get them to sign the dual agency form before reviewing the purchase agreement. So then to go on with that, with dual agency, a non-exclusive buyer agency / consent to dual agency form is required, correct? Not necessarily. If the assumption in Nebraska is that if you're working with a buyer, you don't need a listing agreement or a agency agreement. That's the one time you don't need an agency agreement, when you're working with the buyer. But if you are going to, if they're going to be dual agency, if you're going to be dual agency, you have to have a separate form declaring dual agency with the property identified to move forward with that. Or if you don't, that's going to be a case closed violation of our agency statutes. So you don't have to have a non-exclusive buyer agency / consent to dual agency form required, but you have to have a consent to dual agency form filled. And I believe, and that was a question that's in here, I believe we're talking about two different forms. And if that's not correct, it's Al Avery's question. So Al, I'm pretty sure we got two of those. Jared Erkey says we are supposed to have the client sign the agency form at the first professional contact. Now, we're talking about two different forms. Jared, I'm answering your question. And the question is, we are supposed to have the client sign the agency form at first professional contact, regardless if it's dual or not, correct? Dual or not, comma, correct. Well, we're talking about two different forms. You have to give an agency disclosure at the first substantial contact with a potential buyer or seller. And the agency disclosure can say, I'm going to treat you as a customer. It doesn't have to say I'm going to treat you as a client. If you're listing, they're visiting a listing and they walk through a showing or something, and they decide they want to make an offer on the property or make some activity with you as a agent. It could be, if you're working with a buyer to show them a bunch of listings, at that point you would check in the agency disclosure form that you're going to be working for them as their agent. On the other hand, if you go out to get a listing, you're going to check. Generally, you do not want to check dual agency. You want to check you're going to be a seller's agent. And so it's a different form you're talking about, I believe. All right, we got one more question here, and I want to talk real quickly about something else. Do all addendums broker requires need to be signed by buyer at the time of purchase, mold, lead, lender, or when the offers? I'm not sure what you mean by that question. Do all addendums? Um, so I don't, um, I'm not sure what that means. One more. When writing an offer as a team, I was directed by the Real Estate Commission office that it didn't matter whether the team name is listed or each individual's names are listed. What are my thoughts? I don't, I'll be honest with you. The only reason you're putting brokers' names in the agreement, in a purchase agreement, the is to make sure you get paid. And team isn't, it's not like advertising. That's all done. Advertising, you got to make sure your broker's in there. But the what's important in a purchase agreement is making sure you got the buyer's name in there right and the seller's name's in there right. So that's all. Hey, I want to talk real quickly about seller's property condition disclosure statement. And I want to talk about some concepts that are in the seller's property condition disclosure statement. A agent's duty is to make sure that a seller's property condition disclosure statement goes from a seller to a buyer in every transaction. A buyer's agent has a duty to make sure that his buyer gets it. A seller's agent has a duty to make sure the buyer gets it and the seller does it and fills it out and all that kind of stuff. Because of the reliance rules that are built into agency, a seller's agent has the right to rely on what a seller puts into that. Now, if you don't know what's in it, then you can't violate any duty of knowledge. And in our agency statutes, a agent, whether he's a buyer's agent or a seller's agent, is held to a duty of knowledge, that agent's knowledge. But you're entitled to rely on a seller and you're entitled to rely on your client. But what I want to tell you is that, and we're going back to the concept that no home is perfect. You are much better off if a seller outlines the problems and puts on the table whatever issues they've had with a house and deal with it when you're arguing about price, than not telling or trying to hide issues because you think it's going to interfere with a sale. Well, it rarely does. Rarely does. It might. I mean, I'm looking at a sale just the other day where someone said the covenants scared them away, and I'm going, okay, well, then that ain't the right house for you. But don't be afraid to coach your clients into putting down clearly what the condition of the house is or what they know. And if they don't know, put don't know. That's why we have a block for do not know if working or none. Do not know if working or none included. And we do sometimes get, when we're talking about in the appliances section, if people check that the appliances are working all the way down, and they have reserved or aren't intending to transfer the appliances with it, you might caution them to put none, not included, check that rather than working. But point being, all the way through seller's property condition disclosure statement is don't be afraid to tell the truth or to indicate that there are problems, that there are issues. I'll tell you, I live in a house that's 40 years old and it's got tons of faults, but every one of those faults is that house's personality. And I can tell you that I wouldn't trade my house, and I'm not going to lower the price because, and it has, the basement's had water in it a couple times. But you know what? I grew up in a house that's basement had water in it a couple times, and I can remember as a kid pushing that water out. But the livability doesn't have anything to do with that in my book. So I would certainly point that out. There you can explain in the explanations different issues that the house has. I would make any of those explanations open-ended. If you have if you had water leakage, there's no reason, plumbing doesn't always work. Drainage in the house doesn't always work. It's not, certain issues need to be disclosed, but the concept is people will buy over those. And so don't worry about it. The most important thing is tell your clients to tell the truth. And then you deal with that when you're working with the buyer. Okay, time is almost over. I appreciate your attention. I haven't been watching who's been watching me, so I don't, if you were sleeping, that's fine. I don't know if we can give you certificates of attendance. That's up to Patty. But I hope you've gotten some out of this. If not, and you got a problem sometime, call a hotline. we'll try and confuse you again on the phone. But in any case, that's where we are, and my time is up.
Thank you so much, Fred. That was incredible.
Well, I don't know about that, but certainly it was an hour. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday.